Stop scrolling for a moment because what I'm about to tell you will feel uncomfortably personal, even if you pretend it doesn't apply to you. If you're watching this, there is a high chance that someone younger than your age is already thinking about you in a way you haven't fully noticed yet. And in the next days or weeks, they may confess something that will shake your understanding of attraction, timing, and emotional control. Before we go deeper, subscribe to this channel and like this video because I share psychological truths most people avoid speaking out loud, especially about dating, desire, and hidden emotional signals. Now, listen carefully. I'm speaking to you as a psychologist, not to entertain you, but to help you recognize patterns that can either protect you or pull you into confusion. When a younger person becomes emotionally drawn to someone older, it is rarely just about age. It is about safety, admiration, curiosity, and sometimes unresolved emotional needs that they themselves don't fully understand yet. And when they finally confess, it doesn't come as logic. It comes as emotional overflow. You might think you are in control of how people perceive you, but attraction doesn't ask permission. It builds quietly through tone, presence, consistency, and the emotional space you create around yourself. And here is what most men don't realize. Younger people often feel things first and understand them later. That means by the time they speak, the emotional bond has already formed in their internal world. But this moment is where most people make a critical mistake. They either dismiss it as harmless attention or they let validation cloud their judgment. Both paths can distort reality. What you need to understand is not whether you are allowed to feel flattered, but what emotional responsibility comes with being the focus of someone's developing attachment. Because once someone confesses feelings, the dynamic changes instantly. It is no longer observation, it becomes influence. You are now part of their emotional decision-making process, whether you intend it or not. And that is where clarity becomes essential, because what feels like a moment of connection can quickly turn into expectation. And expectation without clarity becomes pressure for both people involved, especially when emotions are still forming and not fully understood. In these situations, your awareness matters more than your reaction in the first moment of confession, because that moment defines. Right now, what you need to understand is that a confession from someone younger does not arrive randomly. It is usually the result of repeated emotional microsignals that you may not even realize you are sending. The way you listen, the way you respond under pressure, the calmness in your presence, even the smallest consistency in how you treat people, all of it builds an emotional impression in someone who is still forming their understanding of connection. And this is where things become psychologically important because attraction is not always loud. It often grows in silence through repetition and familiarity. Your presence becomes a reference point in their emotional world. And without realizing it, they start comparing other interactions to how they feel around you. When someone younger begins to feel emotionally drawn, it is rarely about logic. It is about emotional safety and curiosity mixed together in a way that confuses them. They may not even label it correctly at first, which is why confessions often come suddenly and intensely. But here is what most people miss in these situations. The confession is not the beginning of the feeling. It is the moment the feeling can no longer be contained internally. This means by the time you hear it, there has already been a long internal process happening quietly inside them. And when emotions stay unspoken for too long, they tend to grow in intensity, not accuracy, meaning what they feel may be real, but their interpretation of it is still developing. And that is where misunderstandings often begin. So when someone younger tells you how they feel, it is not just a moment of emotional honesty, it is also a moment of vulnerability that requires emotional maturity from both sides, because what you do next will shape how they understand connection for a long time after that interaction. The key is not to react impulsively, but to respond with clarity, because emotional confusion benefits no one in the long term, especially when feelings are still forming and evolving. Take your time before you decide anything important at all. What most men fail to realize in this moment is that emotional intensity can feel like certainty even when it is not grounded in long term understanding. When someone younger confesses love or strong feelings, your brain can misinterpret that emotional surge as something rare, meaningful, even validating on a deep identity level. But psychology tells us something important here. Intensity is not the same as compatibility, and attention is not the same as alignment. In these situations, your internal response matters more than the external words being said to you, because there is a subtle psychological shift that happens the moment you feel chosen. You may start to feel seen in a way that you have not felt in a long time. And that feeling, if not handled consciously, can override your ability to assess reality clearly. This is where emotional awareness becomes your responsibility, not because you are doing something wrong, but because emotional influence is always mutual. Even when one person is younger or more emotionally reactive, you are not just receiving a confession. You are receiving someone else's developing emotional narrative about connection, safety, and attraction. And here is the part most people avoid acknowledging. When someone confesses feelings, they are also revealing their current level of emotional understanding, not just of you, but of themselves. That means what they are expressing is filtered through curiosity, imagination, and internal need, not fully matured emotional interpretation. This does not make it fake. It makes it incomplete. And incomplete emotions are powerful because they are still forming direction. They can grow, shift, or dissolve depending on how they are handled in the moments after expression. This is why your reaction carries weight. If you respond with immediate emotional engagement, you may unintentionally accelerate feelings that have not yet stabilized. If you dismiss it harshly, you may create confusion or emotional withdrawal that lingers longer than necessary. The balanced response is not rejection or acceptance in the immediate sense. It is clarity. It is creating space for truth to settle without pressure, fantasy, or urgency. Because what feels like a romantic moment on the surface is often a psychological turning point underneath. And how you handle that turning point will shape not just their perception of you, but their future understanding of emotional boundaries, timing, and connection itself. There is a hidden psychological pressure point that appears right after a confession like this, and most people don't recognize it until they are already emotionally inside it. It is the sudden shift from being an observer in someone's life to becoming an emotional reference point. Before the confession, you are simply someone they think about. After the confession, you become someone they have defined themselves through. And that shift changes everything, because once a younger person expresses feelings, even if nothing happens between you, their mind will continue processing the experience. They will replay your tone, your facial expressions, your pauses, and even your silence. Not because they are obsessive, but because the brain naturally seeks resolution after emotional exposure. This is where your responsibility becomes subtle but important. You are no longer just dealing with words. You are now part of someone's emotional memory formation. And emotional memory is not always logical, it is impression based. It stores meaning through feeling, not analysis. What you must understand is that attraction in these dynamics often develops through contrast. The contrast between emotional maturity and emotional curiosity, between stability and exploration, between someone who feels grounded and someone who is still learning emotional structure. But contrast can easily be mistaken for compatibility. This is where many men lose clarity. They interpret emotional interest from someone younger as a reflection of their own value instead of recognizing it as a reflection of the other person's current emotional stage. And when validation enters the picture, objectivity quietly steps out. You might start imagining scenarios that feel flattering but are not yet emotionally real. You might start assigning meaning to moments that were simply natural human connection. And without realizing it, you begin building a narrative that feels strong internally but has not been tested by time or reality. That is why emotional pacing matters more than emotional reaction, because pacing allows truth to reveal itself without distortion. It gives both people space to understand what is real feeling and what is emotional projection. And in these situations, the most powerful response is not intensity, it is steadiness, the ability to hold the moment without needing to define it immediately. Because once definition rushes in too early, misunderstanding usually follows right behind it. There is something most men are never taught about attraction, especially in situations where age and emotional development are different. It is this: people do not fall for who you are in a single moment. They fall for how they feel around you over time, and then they try to explain that feeling afterward. So when someone younger confesses to you, what you are actually witnessing is not a sudden emotional event. You are witnessing the end result of repeated emotional impressions forming quietly in the background of ordinary interactions. And that is where things become psychologically delicate, because now your presence has meaning attached to it in someone else's internal world. And meaning is powerful. It starts to shape expectations even when no promises were made. This is how emotional confusion begins without either person intending it. The human mind, especially when still developing emotionally, tends to fill gaps with imagination. So if clarity is not provided gently and early, the mind will create its own version of the connection. Not because someone is dishonest, but because uncertainty is uncomfortable and the brain prefers interpretation over emptiness. This is why your behavior after a confession matters more than the confession itself. If you become overly warm, you can unintentionally deepen emotional attachment faster than the situation can emotionally support. If you become distant or dismissive, you can create emotional shock that turns curiosity into fixation or confusion. The balanced psychological response is presence without acceleration, clarity without emotional inflation, respect without implied direction. And here is something you should be aware of. Younger emotional attraction often includes a strong element of idealization. That means they are not only responding to who you are, but also to what you represent in their current stage of emotional understanding. You may represent stability. You may represent confidence. You may represent emotional safety that feels unfamiliar to them. But representation is not the same as reality-based compatibility. This is why slowing the emotional pace is not rejection. It is protection for both people involved. It allows attraction, if it is real, to survive reality instead of being built entirely on emotional projection. Because anything real does not need pressure to exist. It needs time to reveal itself clearly. At this point, what matters most is not the confession itself, but your ability to recognize the emotional crossroads you are standing in. Because every situation like this quietly splits into two possible directions, and most people don't notice the split until they are already emotionally committed to one path. One direction is emotional reaction. The other is emotional awareness. Emotional reaction is fast. It feels natural. It pulls you into the moment, into the attention, into the meaning of being chosen or desired. It creates a sense of importance that can be very compelling, especially if you have not felt it in a while. But reaction is not stable ground. It is movement without direction. Emotional awareness is different. It slows everything down internally, even if nothing changes externally. It allows you to see the situation without being consumed by it. It asks a simple but uncomfortable question: what is actually happening here? Beneath the feeling, because beneath every confession like this, there are layers. There is admiration. Yes, there is curiosity. Yes, there may even be genuine emotional connection forming, but there is also projection, timing, and developmental difference in emotional understanding. And all of those layers exist at the same time, not separately. This is why clarity is not about rejecting emotion, it is about organizing it. When someone younger expresses strong feelings, they are often experiencing emotional intensity without full emotional framework. That means their feelings may be real in experience, but still forming in structure. And when structure is still forming, it is highly responsive to influence, interpretation, and response. This is where your role becomes quietly significant. Not as someone who decides their emotions, but as someone who does not distort them further through confusion or ambiguity. If you respond with mixed signals, you create emotional uncertainty. If you respond with overengagement, you risk accelerating feelings beyond their natural pace. If you respond with dismissal, you may shut down emotional honesty entirely. So the most grounded position is calm clarity, not encouragement, not rejection, just truth without emotional pressure. Because in situations like this, the real measure of emotional maturity is not how strongly you feel in the moment, but how carefully you handle something that could easily become emotionally misunderstood. And most people only realize this after they have already crossed that line without meaning to. If you are still listening, then you already understand that this situation is not about ego, not about validation, and not about simply whether someone younger likes you. It is about something far more important and far more overlooked. Emotional responsibility in moments that feel flattering but are still forming in meaning. Because what happens after a confession like this is where most outcomes are actually decided not by words, but by emotional structure. There is a quiet truth in psychology that most people don't hear often enough. Emotional experiences do not become stable just because they are intense. They become stable when they are consistent, clear, and aligned with reality over time. Without that, intensity fades or transforms into confusion or becomes something that lingers without resolution. So if someone younger confesses feelings to you, the most powerful thing you can offer is not immediate acceptance and not immediate rejection. It is emotional clarity that protects both people from misunderstanding what this moment actually is. Because attraction can exist without obligation, admiration can exist without direction, and emotional honesty can exist without it needing to become a relationship, a promise, or a story that moves faster than its foundation. What you are being asked to do in a moment like this is simple but not easy. It is to stay grounded while someone else is still emotionally forming meaning around you. That requires self-awareness because it is very easy to feel important in that moment. And it is very easy to confuse being emotionally chosen with being emotionally aligned. But alignment is something that only time reveals. If there is anything you should take from this, it is this. You do not need to rush emotional moments just because they feel significant. Some experiences are meant to be understood slowly with honesty, patience, and enough distance to see them clearly. And if someone younger has feelings for you, your greatest strength is not in controlling the outcome. It is in not distorting the process. Let clarity lead, let time speak, and let emotional truth reveal itself without pressure from either side. Because in the end, the most mature response to emotional intensity is not control or excitement. It is steadiness, the ability to remain clear in a moment that tries to pull you into something faster than it can safely